What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I'm going to be bringing you a different type of video that I've only really done once before, and that is a response or rebuttal to another YouTube video that I feel misrepresents a piece of media that I passionately enjoy. Recently, I came across this video titled The Hobbit Trilogy Why It Sucks by the Cosmonaut Variety Hour. Now, I used to be an avid follower of this guy's channel. I enjoyed his videos quite a bit, but as time has gone on, I've come to realize that most of his videos are just him agreeing with whatever the popular consensus is at the time, and if he doesn't agree with the popular opinion, then he does a pretty bad job of substantiating his claims for why he thinks it's bad, and this video is no exception. I will fully admit that I am somewhat biased towards the Hobbit trilogy. I grew up with the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Hobbit book. In fact, I'd say it's probably my favorite book in general, so I was the perfect age for the Hobbit films when they came out. I saw all of them in theaters, and I have a much different experience with them than most other people out there. But even so, I still think that as films, they hold up extremely well, and I look back on them fondly. Are they as good as or better than the Lord of the Rings trilogy? That's up for you to decide. But I genuinely do believe that in our current film landscape, where we are consistently flooded with garbage product after garbage product, it's pretty difficult to find a better or more consistent set of films. And I will be fair in this video. There are some points where I agree with Marcus. He does have some valid arguments. But most of this video is just him recycling the same complaints I've heard about the Hobbit trilogy for years now, without bringing anything new to the table or backing up any of his claims. In fact, a lot of his complaints are things which are explained in the films themselves. I do also understand that his primary goal is to entertain people. He has a very large audience, but in any case, I don't think that humor should take precedence over valid criticism, especially when your job is to be a film critic. But without further ado, let's get into this video. It's 41 minutes. I have written down some of my responses to his claims, but most of this will be me in real time responding to his video.
In my last video, we talked about the Lord of the Rings trilogy, widely accepted to be the greatest film trilogy ever made. It's Oscar award-winning, influential, respected and loved by all. Ask anybody who's seen these movies, and 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you that they love them. And honestly, there's only one thing wrong with these movies. They're owned by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers was like, damn, that property we own that's loved and respected by all? Let's fuck it up and try to make some more money. And obviously they were trying to make a Hobbit movie work for years. They even had Guillermo del Toro signed on to direct it. Honestly, a perfect choice. And really, it seems like it's a pretty good idea so far. I mean, it's the prequel to the series, right? But then Del Toro dropped out. But now Peter Jackson is back to take over, and he did a good job the first time, but then the greed set in. The powers that be wanted to recapture the magic of the original trilogy. And how did they want to do this? Well, not by giving the director extensive time and resources to create their vision. No, they decided to force it to be a trilogy.
Why'd they go and do that?
Now, in case you didn't...
Now, I would like to clarify he's incorrect in this instance. It wasn't the studio's decision to make The Hobbit into a trilogy. From watching the appendices, which are the literally hours of behind the scenes on the Hobbit Extended Edition Blu-rays, Peter Jackson himself states that it was his own creative decision to make it 3 films. He decided to extend the Desolation of Smaug into the Battle of the Five Armies. Just wanted to clarify that, for better or worse, it wasn't strictly the studio's fault, it was also Peter Jackson's decision.
No. The Hobbit is a single book, and it's not very long, and it isn't particularly complex. And when I heard this...
Now, I don't really agree with that, because I think The Hobbit is a fairly complex story, at least as far as its themes are concerned. From a plot perspective, it is a simple story, but the themes of greed and corruption which it explores are quite deep and can resonate with people of any age, myself included.
Be multiple movies, I was very confused, because unlike the original trilogy, I've actually read The Hobbit, and I love it. It's a lovely little character study,
agree.
and Bilbo Baggins is one of my favorite fictional characters.
Yes,
One
I love
thing
Bilbo.
that I think everybody can agree on
is my favorite
is
protagonist.
that this book doesn't really fit into a trilogy. Maybe you can make it work in 2 movies, but 3 is insane. So how do you fill up that much time with so little material? Well, I'll tell you how. You make shit up. For comparison, the first Dune book is about 188,000 words. And that story fits pretty well into 2 movies. I know the second one isn't out yet, but having read the book, it's a safe bet on what's going to be in it. In comparison, The Hobbit is 95,000 words, and they decided to make it into 3 movies. This is even funnier when you consider the fact that Fellowship is about double that, and it only needed 1 movie. So when people say, well, The Hobbit was, it's got too much going on, it needs more than 1 movie, I disagree. Because there's already an animated Hobbit movie, and it's actually pretty good. It's way better than the animated Lord of the Rings movie, and it does a decent job of fitting everything into 90 minutes. That's all killer, no filler. If they gave Peter Jackson 3 hours and 1 movie, I really think he would have done just fine. But no, 1 movie wasn't enough. We want to recapture the magic of the Oscar award-winning trilogy.
Well, I think they did recapture the magic quite well. As I said, it was Peter Jackson's own creative choice to extend The Hobbit into 3 films, and I think they did the best job with that they could have. I do agree that it is slightly bloated towards the end in the Battle of the Five Armies, which is definitely the easiest to pick apart of the trilogy, but it still sticks the landing, in my opinion, and comes together as a satisfying companion piece to The Lord of the Rings.
Resulting films are, well, let's just say, they're certainly different.
This is the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced in my life.
I've seen a lot more obnoxious scenes than that in modern blockbusters, especially MCU films, which this guy loves, by the way.
People say when you watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy for the first time, it feels like they get better and better with each movie. I would say the Hobbit movies are the opposite. They kind of feel like they get a little worse.
I mean, I guess. I think that the Desolation of Smaug improves upon an unexpected journey. The Battle of the Five Armies is definitely a bit of a drop-off after the opening sequence, but it's still solid in my opinion.
They start off fine, but by the end, the story is completely made up of needless bullshit. The movies are so bloated because they had to just make up a bunch of new shit to make it a trilogy.
I'm sick of this idea that making up shit is bad. In my opinion, a lot of the stuff the Hobbit films made up is good and improves upon the source material. It expands on elements that were only briefly alluded to or left completely unexplored in the source material.
So let's dive right in and see how shameless these movies truly are. So this movie stars Martin Freeman as Bilbo Baggins, a normal dude who just wants to get high and eat muffins all day. And then a mysterious wizard shows up at his house and says, hey, I need you to come with me. You're gonna go with these dwarves to kick a dragon out of their house. And Bilbo's like, I don't really want to do that, but he does it anyway. And that's basically the plot of The Hobbit. It's very simple. And for what it's worth, this first movie isn't really that bad, because it kind of just sticks to the book, at least for the most part. And it does have a lot of issues, but those issues become more prevalent later. So firstly, I'm gonna be nice. I'm gonna talk about what I like. And the number one thing is Bilbo, the Hobbit. Martin Freeman is perfect as a younger Bilbo. He encapsulates the character so well. I love all of his regular dude mannerisms. And
now, I would disagree with that. I think his mannerisms are not normal, which is what makes his performance so charming, because he feels almost alien in his performance. He feels like a hobbit. He doesn't feel like a normal guy. A lot of his different facial expressions and movements are just very strange, which I think is what makes him stand out.
Even when these movies are at their lowest point, if Bilbo has a scene, it's usually the best scene in the movie.
Yep.
Because this is like the premier fish out of water story. It's about a normal guy in abnormal circumstances, and Martin Freeman has been playing that role for his whole career. So honestly, he makes for a perfect Bilbo. And the best scenes in the Hobbit book are the ones where Bilbo is alone and has to solve a problem, and the best parts of these movies are those very same moments. Bilbo's game with Gollum is the best scene in this movie. It's just two solid performances bouncing off of each other.
I agree with that, but I don't agree with his idea that the scenes with Bilbo are the only good ones. My favorite scenes in the entire Hobbit trilogy are his conversations with Gollum and Smaug. Those scenes stand out, as he said, because they purely adapt the source material, but I don't think that makes the other scenes or aspects of these films inherently bad.
Now, the problem lies in the fact that outside of this movie, Bilbo's not really the main character of the trilogy. And the thing is, Bilbo's entire character arc from the book, where he learns not to be a stick in the mud, and he learns to take in the adventure and become a little hero, it's all just in this first movie. For some reason, the story speedruns his development, and by the end of the first movie, he is done with his entire character arc. So for 2 sequels, Bilbo is just kind of there, hanging out with dwarves that definitely don't have any development of their own.
Sure, this film shows his journey of stepping out of his comfort zone, leaving behind his comfortable home, and partaking in this adventure. His ultimate moment of courage comes at the end of the film when he steps in to save Thorin, and he proves himself to the rest of the dwarves that he is worthy of being part of the company. But that doesn't conclude his character growth. One of the clips that Marcus just showed there was Bilbo saying, "I do believe the worst is behind us," before the camera pans over to show us the many dangers that still await them. Bilbo has grown into a more brave and noble character by the end of an unexpected journey, but he will be asked to do much more before the journey comes to an end.
Yeah, I should probably talk about all the dwarves. Accompanying Bilbo on his quest are 13 dwarves who want to reclaim their mountain home from the evil dragon. And while, let's say, calling them characters is, well, let's say it's a little dishonest. And you might think, well, how the hell are you supposed to characterize 13 dwarves? And I mean, it's actually not hard to do. You telling me that in 3 movies, it's too hard to characterize 13 dwarves? In the original trilogy, we have 9 main characters. That's not that far off from 13. We don't need full character arcs for all of them. In the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Legolas doesn't have much of a character arc, but he's still a beloved character. Alternatively, I have no idea what this guy's name is. I don't know his personality or his character traits, and he's in all 3 movies.
Now, this is one of the worst examples he could have chosen, because Dwalin, by the way, that's his name, is actually one of the characters, or dwarves, who is given the most characterization. He's somewhat cold and brutish. He is untrusting of other people. We see that when the dwarves are negotiating with Bard to take them into Lake Town. He doesn't show compassion towards Bard when he talks about how he lost his wife, whereas Balin does. And he is a warrior. He's a very stoic, cold character. But we also see he's compassionate, because in the Battle of the Five Armies, he's the one who confronts Thorin and tells him that he's not the man who set out on this quest. He's not the person who he trusted to lead them. So Dwalin does get a decent amount of characterization, but Marcus is just choosing to neglect that fact.
And I don't expect every dwarf to matter right away, but across 3 movies, I at least expect to feel something when they start getting killed off.
I did.
And in the original book, knowing that there's 13 dwarves doesn't really distract you, because you can't see them on screen. In a movie, it's way more distracting when every scene has me thinking, who the fuck is that guy?
That's Oin. He's a pretty fun character. I like him.
Like, honestly, tell me what this dwarf's name is. I'll give you 5 seconds.
His name's Beaufort, and he's one of my favorite characters in the films as well. One of the dwarves who's given the most characterization. He's kind of fun-loving and goofy, but we also see he has a compassionate side as well. He has many interactions with Bilbo, which are some of my favorites in the entire series, when he discusses with Bilbo where his place is in the Fellowship. Bilbo tells him that the dwarves don't have a home, and he admits that he's correct. Even in the Battle of the Five Armies, when Bilbo sneaks away and promises Bofur he'll be back, Bofur says, "Goodbye, Bilbo." He knows Bilbo. They obviously have formed a bond over the course of the trilogy, and that moment hits hard once you've watched all the films and understand the bond all these characters have built up, especially him and Bilbo. Their many interactions over the course of the films do a lot to elevate these later scenes. Bofur's probably my favorite dwarf, in all honesty. I think Marcus is just using the worst possible examples to prove his point here.
His name is Bofur. Bofordy's nuts! And this is a personal gripe, but some of the dwarves don't look like dwarves, and I don't like that. Dwarves need big old beards. It's the worst with Thorin. I get it. They wanted to make him look like Aragorn. They want him to be sexy. I don't care. I don't like it. He needs more beard. I don't look at this guy and see the leader of the dwarves. I see a sexy fantasy hero man. Like, look at this and tell me which one of these two characters is a dwarf. It's this one, the regular guy.
This is such a superficial complaint that really doesn't matter at all. I don't know why you'd want all the dwarves to look the same. He's almost contradicting his own argument here, because he claims the dwarves aren't given enough characterization. We don't know anything about them. But at the same time, the way a character is visualized can also communicate a great deal to us about them. Most characters in fiction are popular because of their appearance, and having watched the appendices myself, knowing the tremendous amount of effort that the creative team on the films went to cast all of the dwarves and design their costumes and appearance, is just kind of discredited when Cosmonaut complains about them not having long beards. This complaint doesn't matter at all. I understand it's subjective, but he's almost contradicting his own argument by bringing up a side argument that holds no merit.
But anyway, the beginning of this movie tries to do the same thing that the previous Lord of the Rings films do. He wants to start with some background, set the tone, and it does it very badly. I commended Fellowship for packing a lot of exposition into a well-cut montage. I really appreciate brevity. But in this, it's just an extended flashback, and honestly, this is all stuff that could have been told to us naturally over the course of the movie. This movie covers less information in a clunkier way. The intro to Fellowship is 8 minutes. The intro to The Hobbit is 15 minutes. So yeah, not really the best start. It's a little disappointing considering how much I love the opening scenes from the previous trilogy.
I don't understand this argument either. I don't see the problem with the intro. He says that it's just padding to stretch out the runtime of the film, but that isn't the case at all. The intro to The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, establishes many key players in the story who will become important later, such as Thranduil, who they just showed right there. They showed that the dwarves took away things that were valuable to Thranduil, and that informs his motivations later in the story. We also see what Thorin's life was like before the beginning of The Hobbit. Thorin is equally the protagonist of this trilogy just as much as Bilbo, so we need to see what his life was like. We need to see what the kingdom of Erebor looked like before it was taken by Smaug, so his motivations seem that much stronger going into the main plot. This complaint doesn't hold any merit, in my opinion. He says that these things could have been explained naturally over the course of the story, but I think they are. This scene just adds a bit more. It contributes to certain characters' motivations, and I don't have a problem with that.
And another thing that comes with the territory of any prequel is that the movie loves to remind you of things that you may remember from the other movies. Remember when Gandalf used his spooky voice at a thematically appropriate moment? Well, now he just does it again. And no, it's not thematically appropriate. He's just doing it because you remember he did it in the other movie. And
I mean, That's not really true. He did use it in an appropriate scene and in an appropriate way. In The Lord of the Rings, he used his spooky wizard voice to snap Bilbo out of his ring obsession and to bring him back to the light. And in this scene in The Hobbit, the dwarves aren't listening to Gandalf. They're just waving off Bilbo. They don't think he's worthwhile as a member of their fellowship. So Gandalf uses his abilities to make them listen. I don't see how that isn't appropriate. I also don't think that Marcus is using the correct term here. He says it isn't thematically appropriate. I think he means, is it appropriate for the story? Because neither of those scenes have much to do with the themes of their respective stories, if you get what I mean.
Remember the soundtrack from those movies? Well, they're mostly reused here. There aren't really that many new compositions, and it's a shame because the few that were made specifically for this movie are really good. Like, the dwarf theme song is one of the best and most fitting themes in the whole series. But other than that, and a few other compositions, we gotta use music that people remember. Thorin is about to make an epic last stand? Well, let's just throw in the Ring Wraith song. The song about evil ghosts. You know, this song has lyrics, right? And the lyrics don't match, and the special effects...
Okay, I'm so sick of hearing this complaint. By saying that these films reuse all of the original music from The Lord of the Rings, you are really discrediting the amount of work Howard Shore put into the score for the Hobbit films. And I don't see the problem with reusing music from The Lord of the Rings. For example, when we see Rivendell, should we not hear the Rivendell theme? When Gollum shows up, should we not hear the theme that Howard Shore used for Gollum in the Lord of the Rings trilogy? When we see the Shire, should we not hear the Shire theme? You get where I'm going with this, but the complaint that the score is reused doesn't hold any merit, because that's what composers should strive for, some level of musical consistency. And I guess we're also ignoring all of the incredible new themes and tracks that Shore composed for the Hobbit trilogy, like Smaug's theme, the themes for the Woodland Elves, or the Flies and Spiders track. No, we're just gonna ignore all that and say that he only reused music from The Lord of the Rings. I also can't stand this stupid criticism of the Ring Wraith music being used. I will agree, it is one of the few times in the Hobbit films where a music choice stands out as being odd to me, but it's one of countless examples where Shore implemented his music to enhance the story, and therefore it doesn't bother me that much. When people complain about the score in the Hobbit films, all they're ever able to do is point to that one example, which I'm sick of. Please come up with a more original complaint or example as to why the score is bad.
And the special effects really are a shadow of their former glory. To start off, everything is green screen now. Even them riding horses outside is green screen.
I understand that this is a hyperbolic statement, he's exaggerating, but he isn't giving credit to the amount of these films, or the first film in particular, that was shot practically. They shot a lot on location in New Zealand, and it shows in the film. A lot of the scenery is beautiful. I still think the cinematography in these films is fantastic. It's on par with The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit films are more reliant on green screen and CGI than The Lord of the Rings, but people also underestimate how reliant The Lord of the Rings trilogy was on green screen. Like I said, I've seen the appendices for both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings used a lot of green screen as well, but people choose to ignore that and only apply that criticism to the Hobbit films for some reason.
There's also that infamous story about Ian McKellen breaking down in tears on set because he was forced to perform all alone in this green prison.
It was so distressing and off-putting and difficult that I thought, I don't want to make this film if this is what I'm going to have to do.
And for some reason, everything has this weird glossy glow, and it kind of makes everything look cheap. It's especially bad when they bring in one of the actors from the other movies, and they have to add this Snapchat filter over their faces to soften their wrinkles. Look how weird Frodo looks.
I mean, he doesn't look that weird to me. I think it's just the lighting. I don't think they added a filter onto anything. At least they don't talk about that in the appendices. It could just be a creative choice, but it's not that off-putting to me. If it is for other people, then fair enough, I guess, but it's never bothered me that much.
Don't you worry, we get to see this very same effect in every movie. Really, the most disappointing aspect of the effects is that the production team did not have access to the mountains of props and practical assets. Again, I don't want to blame PJ for everything. He just didn't have the resources to make this trilogy the same way he did before. So now they just have to rely on CGI. And it's such a bummer. The orcs look so good in the original trilogy. Every one of them looks so unique. And now they're all CGI.
That is not true. There were a lot of practical orc costumes created especially for the goblins in Goblin Town. I will be fair, some of the orcs were just people in green screen costumes, but there were a lot of practical orc costumes created for these films. I've watched the behind the scenes. You can watch them as well. His claims are very easily disproven in that regard. He also isn't fully correct about them not having access to the same resources. They had a lot of the same resources that Guillermo del Toro did before Peter Jackson took over production, but as the films went on, they did lose some of their resources. They used them up, and they did have to rely more on CGI to a point where the Battle of the Five Armies is kind of ugly at points, I will admit, but they did have access to a lot of practical elements. There's some very cool sets that they built, but people just like to ignore that because they want to complain, I guess.
And you gotta look at the orcs for a long time because they are really pushed into this narrative. Because in the Hobbit book, the orcs aren't really that big of a deal. They're just one of many temporary roadblocks for the group. But hey, we gotta add conflict. And again, I'm gonna get more into that in the next movie, because as much as I'm bitching, a lot of these problems don't become big problems until the next one. The positive aspects of this film do make it easier to ignore these things. And there are a lot of positive aspects. At this point in the trilogy, there isn't a ton of made-up original content. A lot of what happens is stuff that happened in the book, and that's usually when these movies are good. I mean, a lot of the dialogue from the opening scenes are just straight up lifted from the books. This movie has a lot of nice moments with Gandalf and Bilbo as well, who I think are probably the strongest characters in the trilogy.
Thorin's great too. I don't know why he's ignoring that. Maybe he doesn't like Thorin because he doesn't have a long enough beard.
A lot of the childlike adventure that you'd expect from The Hobbit is present here. For the most part, this movie does have a much lighter tone than the rest of The Lord of the Rings, and I love that they actually sing the songs, further adding to the storybook vibe, and I like that the action is fun and inventive. I really appreciate that the dwarves don't fight like any other characters that we've seen before. They have their own little style. For instance, the Fellowship members each fight in a way that's very specific to each individual. Gimli just smashes through his enemies like a barbarian, because that makes sense for him. Aragorn is like a man-at-arms. He can fight with like anything. He uses a lot of improvised weapons, showing that you can give him anything to fight with and he's equally dangerous. And then we have Legolas, who's a fucking anime character. But the dwarves all fight with each other. They throw weapons to each other. They do little combos. It's like a fucking fighting game. It's very creative. And most importantly, it suits them. We see this as early on as the scene where they're doing the dishes. The fact that they do chores in the same way that they kill monsters, that's very smart. It's a good detail. I really wish this wasn't the only way we saw their character shine through, but I'll take it.
Now, I almost agree with him here, because I hadn't even thought about the way that the dwarves' fighting style makes them unique. Each individual dwarf uses a different type of weapon or fighting style, and that makes them stand out. It makes them distinct, and I'll give him credit there. I'd never thought of that before, and it makes me appreciate the films even more. Where I disagree with him is that it's the only way their character shines through, because As I previously stated, we do get characterization for a good number of the dwarves. Neither of the examples he used earlier are applicable. Dwalin and Bofer were both given quite a bit of depth in the films. You could point to some of the other dwarves and say that they aren't quite as fleshed out, which I'd agree with, but the examples he used don't work in this instance. But I don't agree with him. That isn't the only way their characterization shines through. Their characterization shines through in their designs. They're each visually distinct, but I guess he doesn't like that because they don't have long enough beards or whatever. I really don't know why he spent so long talking about that.
The movie also has a lot of creative visuals. I like the transition between old Bilbo and young Bilbo, and I really like how the logo has a little smoke ring behind it, emulating the One Ring. There are also a few narrative choices that I think work a little better here. I like that Bilbo has the chance to decide if he wants to go on the adventure or not.
In case some of you don't know what he's talking about, he doesn't really expand on this at all. In the book, Gandalf basically comes back the morning after Bilbo's meeting with the dwarves and kicks him out the front door, telling him to go meet up with the rest of the company. In the context of the film, they basically just leave him behind, and Bilbo makes the conscious choice to go on the adventure, which I do agree is a much better narrative choice that Peter Jackson and the rest of the creative team made in this film.
He has to make the active choice, and I think that's a lot better for his character arc. I also like that they make a point to show that Bilbo really likes hanging out with the elves. And he doesn't need to say out loud, "Boy, I love it here." You can just tell by looking at him in these short scenes where he's just vibing. And it makes
Fair
sense
point.
because later in his life, Bilbo does go on to live with the elves. Little details like this didn't need to be added, but they make the overall picture a little better. I also like...
It shows that they care, but apparently Marcus thinks they don't care about the storytelling and the finer details of these films.
the Goblin song.
I actually don't like that song that much. I like the Goblin song in the context of the book, but in the film, I feel like it does pad out the runtime a little bit in the extended edition, and I find it doesn't tonally fit within the context of the film. Maybe that's just me. I haven't seen a lot of other people complain about that, but it's always stood out to me as being a weird scene in the context of the film.
I think goblins should be in every movie. So yeah, this is definitely the easiest Hobbit movie to enjoy, because a lot of the things that people hate about these movies are either not a big deal yet, or they just haven't been added yet.
I don't fully agree with him. I actually enjoy The Desolation of Smaug the most out of this entire trilogy. I think it takes many aspects of the book, expands upon them, and improves them as well. I love An Unexpected Journey. I think it's great. It's far better than The Battle of the Five Armies, and it's on par with The Lord of the Rings, but I don't think it's better than Desolation of Smaug.
This is the only time that any of these movies feel like they're a part of the Lord of the Rings franchise. So I'm going to give this one an okay out of 10. Let's get to the real shit now.